The rhythmic tap of the carbon fiber cane against the imported Carrara marble floor served as the metronome of my mornings. Tap, slide, tap. The sound echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the Long Island estate, sharp and precise, cutting through the dense silence of Sao. Kong a.m. I sat in the wingback leather chair in the corner of the grand living room, shrouded in the heavy shadows cast by the velvet drapes. The unlit Cohiba cigar rested between my teeth, tasting of dark earth and aged rum. I did not move. I barely breathed. The air in the room was stale, thick with the lingering scent of bourbon from the night before and the sharp tang of wood ash from the massive stone fireplace. Elena entered the room. Her silk robe, the color of crushed pearls, flowed around her ankles like water. Her eyes, pale and clouded over like frosted glass, stared straight ahead into a void only she could comprehend. 10 years. 3,650 days of this exact routine. The car bomb in Palermo had shattered the windshield of our armored Lancia, sending a storm of glass into her beautiful face. The smell of burning rubber and oxidized blood still haunted the back of my throat whenever the weather turned humid. The doctors said the optic nerves were severed. Complete, irreversible darkness. Tap. Slide. Tap. She navigated the labyrinth of antique furniture with the grace of a phantom. She knew the distance between the grand piano and the Persian rug by heart. 14 steps from the doorway to the mahogany liquor cabinet. 6 steps from the cabinet to the edge of the glass coffee table. I watched the rise and fall of her chest, the steady, rhythmic breathing of a woman completely at peace in her lightless world. I reached for the heavy gold Zippo lighter in my pocket. My thumb brushed the cold metal wheel, but I stopped. Last night Frankie had come over late. We had been drinking, discussing the shipment of unmarked cargo containers arriving from Odessa. Frankie, always careless when the whiskey hit his blood, had dragged one of the heavy oak armchairs about 6 inches to the left, encroaching on the invisible path between the sofa and the fireplace. A minor detail. A fractional shift in the geometry of the room. I had forgotten to push it back. Elena kept walking. Her head was tilted slightly, her ears acting as her radar, picking up the subtle shifts in acoustics. 10 steps, 11, 12. The heavy oak leg of the relocated armchair sat directly in her path. A solid block of wood weighing over 80 pounds. Her cane was sweeping from left to right in its familiar arc. It was on the downswing, moving toward the right where the chair now sat. My jaw tightened. The muscles in my neck coiled like heavy-gauge wire. A fraction of a second before the white tip of the carbon fiber cane made contact with the solid oak, Eleanor's wrist twitched. The movement was microscopic. A millimeter of adjustment. The cane halted its arc prematurely, hovering a hair's breadth away from the wood. Her left foot, already mid-stride, adjusted its trajectory. She glided past the obstacle, her silk robe brushing silently against the upholstery. The air in my lungs turned to lead. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single heartbeat. I kept my eyes locked on her back as she reached the silver tray holding the morning espresso carafe. Her hands, delicate and adorned with the heavy diamond ring I gave her in Sicily, moved with mechanical precision. She found the handle of the carafe. She found the small porcelain cup. She poured the dark, steaming liquid. Not a single drop spilled. A shadow crossed the frosted glass of her eyes as she turned toward the center of the room. "You're awake early, Vinny." Her voice was soft, carrying the faint, smoky rasp that always reminded me of old jazz records playing in dimly lit speakeasies. I slowly pulled the Zippo from my pocket. The metallic clink of the lid flipping open sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I struck the flint. The flame illuminated the dark corner where I sat. I drew the fire into the tip of the Cohiba, the harsh, acrid smoke filling my mouth, burning my tongue. "Couldn't sleep," I said. My voice was a low gravel, steady, betraying nothing of the tectonic plates shifting violently beneath the surface of my reality. "The shipment?" she asked, walking toward me. She stopped exactly 2 feet from my chair, offering the porcelain cup. The scent of lavender soap on her skin mixed with the bitter aroma of the espresso. "Just business, Elle." I reached out and took the cup from her hand. My fingertips brushed hers. Her skin was ice cold. "Frankie left a mess in the study," she murmured, turning her head slightly toward the hallway. "I can smell the cheap cologne and stale scotch from here. I'll have Maria clean it up." She nodded, turning around to face the grand window overlooking the Atlantic. The morning sun was just beginning to pierce through the grey, overcast sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. She stood there, bathing in the weak light, a portrait of tragic beauty, a blind queen in a castle built on blood and extortion. My eyes drifted back to the oak armchair. 6 inches, a sudden adjustment of the wrist, a microscopic twitch of the foot. Blind people memorize spaces. They count steps. They rely on the physical feedback of the cane. They do not anticipate an obstacle they have not touched unless they hear it. The chair made no sound. The espresso in my mouth tasted like battery acid. I swallowed it down, the heat searing my esophagus. I stood up, the leather of the chair creaking under my weight. I walked toward her, my footsteps deliberately heavy on the marble. I wrapped my arm around her waist, pulling her back against my chest. I buried my face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the lavender. Her pulse beat steadily against my lips. Calm, measured, perfect. "I have to go down to the docks," I whispered near her ear. "Rostova is making noise about the customs fees." "Be careful," she replied, her hand coming up to rest over mine. I kissed her cheek. "Always." I left the living room, my dress shoes clicking against the floor tiles. I bypassed the main staircase and headed down the long, narrow corridor leading to the east wing of the estate. The air grew cooler here. The thick stone walls absorbed the heat, maintaining a perpetual chill. At the end of the corridor was a heavy iron door, painted black, securing the entrance to the basement. The basement was a labyrinth of old wine cellars and storage rooms, retrofitted with soundproofing and reinforced concrete. It was the nerve center of the Maranzano family's private operations, a place where ledgers were kept, where guests were occasionally questioned, and where a massive Mosler vault held the liquid assets we kept off the grid. Elena never came down here. The stairs were steep, uneven stone, an impossible hazard for a blind woman. It was an unspoken rule of the house. The basement did not exist in her world. Frankie was waiting for me near the iron door. He wore a heavy black wool overcoat, his collar turned up against the draft. The smell of rain and ozone clung to his clothes, masking the underlying scent of gun oil that always seemed to seep from his pores. He held a manila folder in his left hand. His right hand rested casually inside his coat pocket, exactly where the grip of his suppressed Beretta lay. "Victor is moving the time up," Frankie said, not bothering with a greeting. His voice was a flat monotone. "Midnight tonight, Pier Bon Muy High. He says the Port Authority is doing unexpected sweeps tomorrow." "He's getting nervous," I noted, taking the folder from him. I didn't open it. "Or he's setting up a crossfire. How many men is he bringing?" "Hard to tell. His brats from Brighton Beach have been quiet. Too quiet. I got our guys loading the suburbans. We bring the heavy stuff." "No chances." "Good." I stepped past Frankie to unlock the iron door. I reached into my jacket for the heavy brass key. As I inserted it into the master padlock, something caught my eye. I stopped. The hallway was dimly lit by a single wrought iron sconce on the wall. The light cast deep shadows over the heavy metal of the door. "What is it, boss?" Frankie asked, his posture shifting, his body instantly tensing for a threat. I leaned closer to the padlock. The solid brass surface of the lock was usually dull, tarnished by the damp air of the corridor, but right at the edge of the keyhole there was a tiny, jagged scratch, fresh metal gleaming against the tarnish. A microscopic gouge, no thicker than a human hair, as if something sharp and hardened had been forced into the mechanism, slipping briefly before catching. My thumb traced the scratch. The metal was still rough. I lowered my head closer to the lock, inhaling deeply. Beneath the metallic tang of the brass, beneath the smell of Frankie's wet wool coat, there was something else. A scent so faint, so ephemeral, it was almost an illusion. Lavender. The muscles in my back locked. The silence in the corridor suddenly felt suffocating, pressing against my eardrums with immense pressure. "Vinny?" Frankie's voice was sharper now, his hand pulling half an inch out of his pocket. "Nothing," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the cold fire spreading through my veins. "Just a stiff lock." I turned the key. The heavy mechanism clicked with a dull, heavy thud. I pushed the iron door open, the rusted hinges groaning into the darkness of the stairwell. 10 years of absolute darkness. 10 years of the white cane sweeping across the marble. 10 years of leading her by the arm through crowded restaurants, slicing her steak, describing the colors of the sunset she claimed she could only remember. The image of her wrist, twitching a fraction of a second before hitting the oak chair, burned itself into the back of my eyelids. The gleaming scratch on the padlock reflected in my mind like a strobe light in a pitch-black room. I descended the steep stone stairs into the darkness, the cold air rushing up to greet me, carrying with it the metallic scent of old blood and the sudden, overwhelming realization that the woman sleeping in my bed had been watching me from the shadows for 3,650 days. The heavy iron door swung shut behind me, the rusted hinges groaning before the latch engaged with a final, echoing thud. The air in the stairwell was dead, trapped for decades between the thick limestone blocks. It smelled of damp earth, oxidized copper, and the faint, unmistakable odor of old blood that had seeped into the concrete floor long before my father bought this estate. I moved down the steep steps, my leather soles making dull, rhythmic sounds against the stone. At the bottom, the corridor stretched out, lit only by low-wattage bulbs encased in wire mesh. The shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs. I walked past the old wine cellars, the wrought-iron gates locked tight over thousands of bottles of Barolo and Chianti, slowly turning to vinegar in the dark. My destination was at the very end of the hall, the vault room. The walls here were reinforced with steel plates hidden behind the plaster. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees. I could see the faint mist of my own breath in the dim light. I stopped in front of the massive Mosler vault door, a relic from a decommissioned Chase Manhattan branch we had acquired in the late 90s. Its brushed steel surface was cold to the touch. I rested my hand on the heavy chrome spinning wheel. I did not move to turn the dial. I just stood there, letting the silence of the underground press against my eardrums. My mind was running 1,000 calculations a second, stripping away layers of reality I had accepted for a decade. The microscopic scratch on the padlock upstairs, the fractional adjustment of her wrist to avoid the chair, the scent of lavender hanging in a corridor she was supposed to be completely ignorant of. I crouched down, bringing my face close to the smooth concrete floor. The basement was cleaned once a month by a trusted crew, sweeping away the dust that naturally accumulated. I looked for disturbances. The floor immediately in front of the vault was spotless, polished by the frequent pacing of my own shoes. I shifted my attention to the periphery, toward the narrow gap between the heavy steel frame of the vault and the plaster wall. I pulled a small, high-powered maglite from my coat pocket and clicked it on. The harsh white beam cut through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light. I traced the beam along the baseboard. There, pushed deep into the corner where the broom never reached, was a small grey smudge. I reached out and rubbed my index finger over it. It was ash, not the heavy, dark ash of my Cohiba cigars, but something finer, lighter, cigarette ash. Elena did not smoke. Frankie smoked parliaments, but Frankie never came down here alone. Only I held the master key to the iron door upstairs. Or so I thought. I stood up and approached the old wooden desk, pushed against the opposite wall. It was where I kept the physical ledgers, the books that never saw the light of a computer screen. Columns of numbers dictating the flow of extortion money, union kickbacks, and gambling debts from Queens to Atlantic City. I opened the top drawer. The heavy leather-bound books were stacked exactly as I had left them. I checked the spine of the ledger for the waterfront operations. The slight layer of ambient dust on the top edge was disturbed. 4 clear parallel lines where fingers had grasped the book and pulled it out. Small fingers, the air in my lungs turned to crushed ice. I turned around, the maglite sweeping across the room. The false trail began to lay itself out before me, a path of breadcrumbs illuminated by the harsh glare of betrayal. If she was not blind, if she had a key, if she was reading the ledgers, she was looking for something specific. Money, routes, schedules. I walked toward the far corner of the room, behind the heavy wooden desk. A stack of wooden crates filled with untraceable bearer bonds sat against the wall. I grabbed the top crate and hauled it aside. The wood splintered slightly against my grip. I moved the second crate. Behind them, the plaster wall was slightly discolored, a patch of dampness that I had always ignored as natural basement condensation. I pressed my palm against the cold plaster. I felt a slight give. The surface was not solid stone like the rest of the foundation. It was a hollow cavity. I drew the heavy, fixed-blade hunting knife I kept strapped to my ankle. I jammed the steel point into the plaster and ripped it downward. The drywall crumbled, releasing a cloud of white dust that tasted like chalk and decay. A rectangular hole opened up, revealing a small cavity between the studs. Inside the cavity rested a black steel lockbox. My pulse pounded in my temples, a steady, heavy drumbeat. I reached into the dark hole and pulled the box out. It was heavy. It was locked with a simple keyhole. I didn't bother looking for a key. I wedged the tip of my hunting knife under the lid and twisted with all my strength. The cheap metal latch snapped with a sharp crack that echoed off the Mosler vault. I opened the lid. The smell hit me first. Stale tobacco and expensive leather. Inside the box lay a prepaid burner phone, a stack of heavily encrypted offshore bank routing numbers written on expensive cardstock, and a silver money clip holding a thick wad of $100 bills. I picked up the money clip. The silver was tarnished, but the engraved initials were clear under the beam of the maglight. F.C. Frankie Costello. My thumb rubbed over the engraved letters. The cold metal bit into my skin. The puzzle pieces snapped together with horrifying, violent clarity. The cognitive trap was perfectly constructed, drawing me inexorably toward a single, logical conclusion. Frankie, my right hand. The man who took a bullet in the shoulder for me outside a Brooklyn bakery 12 years ago. Frankie and Elena. The narrative wrote itself in my head, fueled by paranoia and the undeniable physical evidence in my hands. Elena wasn't a mastermind. She was an asset. Frankie had access to everything but the vault. He needed the ledgers to siphon money off the waterfront shipments to his own offshore accounts. He couldn't get past the iron door without my key, but Elena could. Elena, who lived in the house. Elena, who had unlimited time to copy the key while I slept. She faked the blindness, or perhaps she had partially recovered years ago and kept it a secret, using the ultimate disguise of absolute vulnerability to move through my world unseen. They were bleeding me dry. I picked up the burner phone. The battery was dead. I shoved it, along with the routing numbers and the money clip, into my overcoat pocket. I pushed the lockbox back into the wall cavity and kicked the wooden crates back into place, kicking a layer of dust over my tracks. The heat of rage began to replace the cold shock in my chest. A slow, dark fire. I walked back up the stone stairs. The smell of lavender was gone, replaced entirely by the scent of my own sweat and the metallic tang of adrenaline. I walked out of the estate and into the freezing Long Island rain. My armored Cadillac Escalade was waiting in the circular driveway. The engine was already running, the exhaust pluming in the cold morning air. Frankie was leaning against the passenger side door, his hands deep in the pockets of his wool coat, a freshly lit parliament hanging from his bottom lip. I stopped on the top step of the porch, letting the freezing rain hit my face. I watched him. The way his shoulders slouched slightly, the way his eyes constantly scanned the perimeter, a habit born of 20 years in the streets. He looked exactly like the man I trusted with my life. He looked exactly like a man planning a funeral. "Everything good in the crypt, boss?" Frankie asked, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. He flicked his cigarette onto the wet asphalt, the ember dying instantly. "Fine," I said, my voice smooth, devoid of the violence coiling in my gut. "Just reviewing the inventory before we meet Victor tonight." "Victor is an animal," Frankie said, opening the rear door for me. "I still don't like moving the time up to midnight. Pier Bonmoy High is too open." Too many sightlines from the shipping cranes. If the Russians want to get cute, we're sitting ducks. We bring the heavy rifles, I said, sliding into the leather seat. Put snipers on the cranes before Victor even arrives. We control the high ground. Frankie closed the door and got into the front passenger seat. The heavy doors locked with a solid, reassuring thud. The driver, a quiet kid named Carmine, put the SUV in gear, and we rolled out of the iron gates. "I'll make the calls," Frankie said, pulling his phone from his pocket. I watched the back of his head from the rear seat. My hand rested on the fabric of my coat, feeling the hard outline of the silver money clip in my pocket. I watched his reflection in the side mirror. His jaw was tense. His eyes kept darting toward the rearview mirror, checking to see if I was looking at him. It was a micro-expression of guilt, a subtle shift in his baseline behavior. He was nervous. The shipment tonight wasn't just a handoff, it was a trap. Frankie and Victor Rostova were making a play, and Elena was the inside man, feeding them my schedules and the layout of the estate. The drive into the city was a silent procession through sheets of grey rain. We headed toward the meatpacking district, to an old pork processing plant that served as a front for our wholesale distribution. The smell of raw meat, ammonia, and wet cardboard hit us the moment we stepped out of the SUV. We walked through the loading bays, past hanging carcasses of pigs, swinging slowly on metal hooks. The air inside the freezer section was brutal. My breath plumed in thick white clouds. The back office was a stark contrast, heated by a rattling space heater and filled with the thick blue smoke of cheap cigars. 5 of my capos were sitting around a folding metal table, playing a lethargic game of 5-card stud. They stood up when I entered, a chorus of scraping chairs and mumbled greetings. I waved them back down and took a seat at the head of the table. Frankie stood by the door, his arms crossed. "Tonight is heavy," I said, dropping my voice an octave so it carried over the hum of the freezer units outside. "Rostova is moving 60 crates of untraceable military hardware through Pier Bornwe High. He changed the time on us. Midnight. I don't like it." Pauli, a heavy-set man with a scar running through his left eyebrow, threw his cards on the table. "The Russians are always pushing the line, Vinny. We smack them back or they take the whole yard." "We don't smack them yet," I said, my eyes drifting to Frankie. "We secure the perimeter. Pauli, I want 12 men with long guns. Take control of the Port Authority Tower and the 2 northern cranes. Nobody breathes on that pier without our permission." "Done," Pauli grunted. "Frankie," I said, my voice shifting to a casual conversational tone that I knew set everyone in the room on edge. "You sure your guys swept the perimeter? No Port Authority patrols lingering?" Frankie shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. "Attell, I paid off the shift captain yesterday. The pier is a ghost town until Sao, Hong AM. Good." I leaned back in the cheap folding chair, pulling a cohiba from my breast pocket. I took my time cutting the end and lighting it, letting the heavy silence fill the room. The space heater rattled violently. "You've been spending a lot of time out at the house lately, Frank. Late nights, bringing the paperwork out. I appreciate the hustle." The room went dead. The capos stopped looking at their cards. They knew my tone. They knew what it meant when I brought up personal matters in a business setting. Frankie's jaw muscles feathered. The skin around his eyes tightened, pulling the crow's feet taut. He didn't look at me directly. He looked at the glowing tip of my cigar. "Just making sure the books are straight for the audit, boss. With the feds poking around the waste management front, we can't be too careful." "That's right," I said softly, blowing a thick cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. "Can't be too careful. The feds are one thing. The people inside your own house, that's another." Frankie swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. "You got a problem with the security at the estate, Vinny?" "No problem," I smiled, a slow, cold pulling of the lips that held zero warmth. "Security is perfect. Nobody gets in or out without me knowing." I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The capos scrambled to their feet. I walked past Frankie, stopping just inches from his face. He smelled of rain, wool, and the bitter copper scent of fear sweat. I reached out and patted the lapel of his coat. "Make sure your guns are clean for tonight, Frankie. I want you right beside me." "Always, boss," he muttered, his eyes locked on the floor. I left the meatpacking plant and ordered Carmine to drive me to Brighton Beach. I needed to look Victor Rostova in the eyes before the sun went down. The rain had turned into a thick, freezing sleet, hammering against the bulletproof glass of the Escalade. Victor operated out of a traditional Russian bathhouse, a massive brick building that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage, eucalyptus oil, and dirty mop water. I walked in alone. Carmine and two heavy hitters waited in the lobby, their hands resting inside their coats. The heat inside the steam room was a physical force, a dense wall of vapor that coated my lungs in liquid fire. I stripped down to a towel and walked into the heavy fog. The wooden benches were slick with condensation. Through the thick white steam, I saw the massive silhouette of Victor Rostova. He was built like a Soviet tank, his skin pale and covered in crude prison tattoos, mapping his rise through the Vor-Visa cone. He sat with his eyes closed, breathing rhythmically. Vincent, his deep, gravelly voice echoed through the steam. He didn't open his eyes. You bring the cold weather with you. You change the time, Victor, I said, sitting on the bench opposite him. The heat was making my heart race, amplifying the adrenaline already coursing through my system. Victor opened one eye, a pale blue chip of ice staring through the fog. The Port Authority is restless. A daytime transfer is suicide. Midnight is safe. The dark hides many sins. The dark also hides ambushes, I replied, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. My men are locking down the pier. Any uninvited guests will be dealt with severely. Victor chuckled, a wet, heavy sound originating deep in his chest. He reached for a wooden bucket of ice water and dumped it over his head. The water hissed as it hit his hot skin. You are a paranoid man, Vincent. It is what keeps you alive. But sometimes, a man looks so hard at the shadows outside his house, he forgets to check the locks on the inside. The air in my lungs stalled. I stared at the massive Russian, analyzing every millimeter of his scarred face. The steam swirled around us, hot and suffocating. What does that mean, Victor? My voice was barely a whisper, a lethal razor slicing through the heavy air. Victor wiped the water from his eyes. He leaned forward, his massive frame closing the distance between us. The smell of stale vodka and iron radiated from his pores. It means, Vincenzo, that a blind wife is a blessing. She does not see the blood on your hands. But a wife who is not blind, she sees everything. And what she sees, she can sell. He leaned back, closing his eyes again. Midnight, Vincent. Bring the money. Leave the paranoia at home. I stood up, the heat in the room suddenly intolerable. I walked out of the steam room without another word, my skin crawling, my mind racing through the dark corridors of the false trail I had constructed. The puzzle was complete. Victor knew. Frankie was the broker. Elena was the spy. They were going to kill me tonight at Pier Bournemouth High and take the family, the money, and the port. It was clean. It was logical. It was exactly the kind of treacherous mathematics the Underworld thrived on. I got dressed in the cold locker room, the damp air chilling the sweat on my skin. I pulled my heavy overcoat on and reached into the pocket, my fingers wrapping tightly around Frankie's silver money clip. The sharp edges dug into my palm, grounding me, focusing the violence that was about to be unleashed. The ride back to Long Island was a death march. The sky had turned a bruised purple, the sleet turning back to a steady, freezing rain. I stared out the window, watching the blur of the city lights reflecting off the wet asphalt. I had to go back to the estate. I had to face the phantom pacing the marble floors. I needed to look into those clouded, frosted eyes and see the lie hiding behind them. The Escalade pulled up to the front steps of the estate at Sao. Hong p.m. The house was completely dark, save for the single light burning in the grand living room. I told Carmine to wait in the car. I walked up the steps, the heavy oak door unlocking under my hand. I stepped into the foyer. The house was dead silent. The smell of lavender was gone. In its place was something else. A smell so subtle, so out of place, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was the faint, metallic scent of gun oil. Freshly applied, I drew the heavy, Bunmilam caliber Colt 1911 from my shoulder holster. I thumbed the safety off, the mechanical click sounding like a thunderclap in the silent hallway. I moved toward the living room, my footsteps absolutely silent on the thick Persian runner. The false trail was solidifying into a concrete reality. Frankie was already here. They were moving their timeline up. I stepped into the archway of the living room, leading with the heavy barrel of the Colt. The room was cast in deep shadows, the single floor lamp casting long, distorted shapes across the walls. Eleanor was sitting in my wingback leather chair. She was wearing a black silk dress, her legs crossed, perfectly still. The carbon fiber cane was nowhere to be seen. I raised the gun, pointing it dead center at her chest. I didn't speak. I held my breath, waiting for the trap to spring, waiting for Frankie to step out of the shadows. "You're tracking mud onto the marble, Vinny," she said. Her voice was perfectly calm. She didn't turn her head. She didn't use her ears to locate me. She simply lifted her chin, her pale, frosted eyes staring directly, unerringly, down the barrel of my gun. The heavy steel of the Colt, 1911, felt suddenly weightless in my grip. My finger rested flat against the trigger guard. I stared down the iron sights, aligning the front post perfectly with the hollow of Elena's throat. The floor lamp cast a sickening yellow hue across her face. She did not flinch. Her breathing remained uneven, metronomic rise and fall of her chest beneath the black silk. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her right hand. The heavy diamond ring I had placed on her finger a decade ago caught the weak light, flashing a brilliant, mocking white. She brought her index finger to her right eye. The perfectly manicured nail pressed against the sclera. A wet, soft click sounded in the quiet room. She pinched the surface of her eye and pulled. A thin, opaque, milky white contact lens came away on her fingertip. She blinked. The eye underneath was a piercing, hyper-clear emerald green. The pupil dilated slightly as it adjusted to the ambient light, locking onto the muzzle of my gun with the precision of a sniper picking a target. She repeated the process with her left eye. Another wet click. Another milky disc discarded onto the glass coffee table. 2 emerald eyes. Sharp, unblinking, calculating. The air in my lungs turned to ash. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, a slow, nauseating rotation that pulled the gravity out from under my feet. 10 years. I had bathed her, dressed her, guided her through crowds, read documents out loud to her. I had treated her as the one fragile thing in a universe built on extortion and hollow-point bullets. "The mud, Vinny," she repeated, her voice dripping with the smoke of old speakeasies, completely devoid of fear. "You stepped in a puddle near the gate. It is drying on the Carrara. A shame." Maria spent 3 hours polishing it. My thumb swept the hammer back on the Colt. The metallic clack was deafening. "Where is Frankie?" Eleanor leaned back in the leather chair, the upholstery creaking under her shifting weight. "Frankie is exactly where you told him to be, prepping the long guns, securing the high ground at Pier Bornmoy High, loyal to a fault, stupid to the bone." I reached into my overcoat pocket with my left hand, never letting the sights drift from her chest. I pulled out the tarnished silver money clip and tossed it onto the glass table. It landed next to the discarded lenses with a harsh rattle. "His clip," I rasped, the words tearing through my throat like broken glass. "In the basement, behind the crates." Eleanor looked at the money clip. A slow, chilling smile spread across her lips. It was a smile I had never seen before. It was a predator's smile, all teeth and absolute zero temperature. "You always underestimate the details, Vinny," she murmured. "You build the vault, but you ignore the plaster. Frankie dropped that clip in the Escalade 2 months ago. Carmine found it. Carmine gave it to me." My grip tightened on the gun. The puzzle pieces I had so violently jammed together this morning began to shatter. The trap I thought I had uncovered was a decoy. The real snare was already wrapped around my neck, tightening with every breath. The ash on the floor, I said, my voice barely audible over the ringing in my own ears. The scratch on the padlock. "Breadcrumbs," she whispered, her green eyes reflecting the dull light. "Left for a rat traversing a maze. I needed you to check the basement. I needed you to find the cavity. I needed you to look at Frankie and see a traitor. If I told Victor to move on the pier tonight, Frankie would have died protecting you. He is a shield. I needed you to leave your shield behind. The smell of gun oil. It was not coming from Elena. It was heavier. It smelled of industrial solvents and cold steel. It was drifting from the dining room archway behind me. The perspective flipped, a violent whiplash that snapped my spine into absolute rigidity. Frankie wasn't the rat. Frankie was a dead man walking into a meat grinder at the pier, completely abandoned by a boss who thought he was a turncoat. I was alone. The men I had left at the meatpacking plant were heading to the docks. Carmine was outside in the SUV. The house was empty, except it wasn't. I did not turn my head. I kept the gun aimed at Elena, but my peripheral vision caught a shift in the density of the shadows spilling from the dining room. A shape, darker than the gloom, detached itself from the wall. "Victor doesn't negotiate for peers, Vinny," Elena said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He negotiates for empires." She threw her body to the right, rolling out of the wingback chair just as the shadow in the dining room moved. I pulled the trigger. The Colt roared, a deafening explosion of expanding gases and burning cordite. The Bonmulam caliber slug tore through the heavy leather of the chair, exactly where Elena's chest had been a millisecond before, ripping a fist-sized hole in the upholstery and sending a cloud of white stuffing into the air. Simultaneously, the air to my left compressed. A suppressed weapon coughed 3 rapid times. F. The plaster on the wall right next to my temple exploded. Razor-sharp fragments of drywall showered the side of my face. I dropped to the floor, rolling hard across the Persian rug. The smell of sulfur and burned dust instantly suffocated the scent of lavender. I came up on one knee behind the heavy oak liquor cabinet. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the rain hammering against the tall windows. I peered around the edge of the mahogany wood. The shadow in the dining room stepped into the ambient light. A heavy-set man wearing black tactical gear, his face obscured by a neoprene balaclava. Spetsnaz, Victor's elite from the motherland. He held a suppressed Vitiaz submachine gun tucked tightly against his shoulder, tracking the room with mechanical efficiency. Elena was gone. She had vanished into the maze of furniture, slipping away with the same phantom grace she had used to avoid the oak chair this morning. But this time, she wasn't relying on sound. She had her eyes. I checked the magazine of my Colt. 7 rounds left, 1 in the chamber, 8 against an unknown number of Russian hitters inside my own fortress. The Spetsnaz operative stepped slowly into the living room. His heavy boots crunched on the shattered plaster. He moved methodically, slicing the pie around the grand piano, clearing his angles. He was looking for blood trails. He was looking for a corpse. I steadied my breathing. The pounding in my chest slowed, retreating behind a wall of cold, survivalist mathematics. I knew the geometry of this room better than I knew the back of my own hand. I knew the acoustics. I knew the blind spots. I reached to the bottom shelf of the liquor cabinet, my fingers wrapping around the thick neck of an unopened bottle of Macallan Heimwilum. I slid it across the marble floor toward the fireplace. The heavy glass rolled, making a low, rumbling sound. The operative snapped his weapon toward the noise. The suppressed Vitiaz coughed a rapid burst. The heavy crystal bottle shattered into 1,000 pieces, sending a spray of amber liquid and the sharp reek of peat and alcohol into the air. He had committed his barrel away from my position. I stood up, stepping out from behind the cabinet. My front sight found the dark mass of his chest. I fired twice. The unsuppressed reports of the Colt hit the vaulted ceiling like cannon fire. The first round punched through his tactical vest, breaking a rib. The second caught him in the throat above the ceramic plate. A mist of dark blood sprayed against the beige wallpaper. He dropped instantly, a dead weight collapsing onto the Carrara marble, his weapon clattering across the floor. The ringing in my ears deepened. The silence that followed the gunshots was unnatural, heavier than before. The house was a tomb, and I was the main exhibit. I moved from the liquor cabinet, staying low, keeping my back to the solid wall. I needed to reach the east wing corridor. I needed the basement. The vault room held an armory of automatic weapons and a hardline satellite phone that circumvented the local network. I stepped over the pooling blood of the Russian operative. The metallic stench of copper mixed aggressively with the spilled scotch. I checked the hallway leading to the foyer. Empty. The front door was slightly ajar, letting the freezing wind and rain whip into the entranceway. Carmine was dead. They wouldn't have entered without neutralizing the driver. I moved toward the east wing. Every shadow looked like a gun barrel. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep. The perspective flip was absolute and terrifying. For a decade, I had walked these halls believing I was the architect of my reality. I had built the walls, paid the guards, controlled the flow of information. But Eleanor had been the true architect. She had lived inside my defenses, observing my routines, mapping my blind spots, waiting for the perfect alignment of greed and opportunity to strike. She had weaponized my own paranoia against me. I reached the entrance to the east wing corridor. The long, narrow passage was dark. The single wrought-iron sconce on the wall had been smashed. Glass crunched under my leather soles. The temperature dropped, the damp chill of the stone creeping into my bones. At the far end of the corridor, the heavy black iron door stood shut. I moved down the hall, the Colt leading the way. The darkness was absolute. I relied on memory, trailing my left hand along the rough stone wall to keep my bearing. 10 steps. 15. 20. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the iron door. I reached into my pocket for the heavy brass key. The scrape of a boot on stone echoed from the staircase behind me. I spun around, dropping to a crouch. The hallway was a pitch-black tunnel. I couldn't see anything. I held my breath, opening my mouth slightly to equalize the pressure in my ears, listening intently. A slow, deliberate inhalation of air. The rustle of wet nylon. Another operative, moving in the absolute dark, using night vision. I was completely exposed, a heat signature glowing brightly against the cold stone door. I had no cover, no concealment. I pressed my back flat against the iron, raising the Colt. A suppressed shot hissed through the dark. The bullet sparked violently against the iron door, inches from my left ear. Chips of lead and rusted metal stung my cheek. I fired blindly down the corridor. The muzzle flash of the Colt illuminated the hallway for a fraction of a second, a strobe light of blinding yellow fire. In that freeze frame of illumination, I saw him. 20 feet away, kneeling, 4 glowing green lenses of a panoramic night vision goggle strapped to his helmet. The darkness swallowed the corridor again. I threw myself flat on the ground, just as a burst of suppressed fire chewed into the iron door, exactly where my chest had been. The metal sang, a harsh, vibrating hum. I fired twice more, aiming low, right down the center line of the corridor. A wet thud, a sharp intake of breath, a heavy body hitting the stone floor. I scrambled to my feet, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped animal. I fumbled with the master padlock. I jammed the brass key into the hole. It didn't turn. I twisted violently. The metal groaned. I pushed harder, the brass key digging into the meat of my palm. The lock mechanism was jammed tight. I leaned closer, my nose inches from the metal. The faint smell of cyanoacrylate. Superglue. The scratch on the lock this morning. It wasn't a sloppy mistake made while picking it. She hadn't broken in. She already had a copy of the key. The scratch was misdirection. While I was in the city dealing with the false trail she had built, she had glued the locking pins solid. She wanted to trap me on the ground floor. Rage, pure and unadulterated, flushed the cold fear from my veins. The fire ignited behind my eyes. I stepped back, leveling the Colt at the heavy brass body of the padlock. I angled the barrel downward to avoid ricochets. I pulled the trigger twice. The heavy, Bornmuy lumslug smashed into the brass, shattering the internal tumblers. The lock burst open in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. I kicked the iron door hard. It swung inward, groaning into the darkness of the stairwell. I plunged down the steep stone steps, taking them 2 at a time in total blackness. The air rushed up, smelling of damp earth, and the ghost of the cigarette ash Elena had planted. I hit the basement floor and sprinted toward the vault room. The wire mesh bulbs flickered, casting long, frantic shadows. I reached the massive Mosler door. I didn't need light for this. Muscle memory took over. 3 turns right past Bun Mui Lam, stop at Mui Hai. 2 turns left past Bai Mui Tam, stop at Ba Mui Bun. Right to Chin Mui. The heavy chrome wheel engaged with a solid, mechanical clunk. I threw my body weight onto the handle, hauling the massive steel door open. I stepped inside the vault, reaching for the wall switch. The fluorescent overheads flickered on, bathing the room in harsh, clinical white light. Stacks of banded $100 bills lined the shelves. Bearer bonds, passports, the accumulated wealth of 3 generations of violence. But I didn't look at the money. I moved directly to the steel gun cabinet in the corner. I punched the code into the keypad, grabbed a short-barreled Mossberg, Namtram Chin Mui pump-action shotgun, and stuffed handfuls of cum buckshot shells into my coat pockets. I grabbed the satellite phone resting on the wooden desk. I punched in Frankie's secure number. The line hissed with static. "Come on, Frank. Pick up," I muttered, pacing the concrete floor. The call connected. "Vinny?" Frankie's voice was distorted by the wind and the encrypted signal. "Frankie, listen to me. Pull the men out. Abort the pier. It's a trap." "Abort?" "Boss. Victor is already here. He just rolled up to the gate with 3 armored trucks. We got the long guns dialed in, but they're deploying heavy." What the hell is going on? The floor beneath my feet seemed to dissolve. Victor was at the pier. Elena was at the house. The betrayal wasn't isolated. It was a synchronized decapitation strike against the entire Maranzano family. "Do not engage, Frankie. Drop the guns and run. Victor's men are in the house. Elena sold us out. She's working with the Russians." A long silence on the other end of the line. The sound of heavy diesel engines revving in the background. "Elena?" Frankie's voice was barely a whisper. The cognitive dissonance was shattering his reality, just as it had shattered mine. "Vinny, she's blind. She sees everything, Frank. The clip, the ash. She set you up to take the fall. Run, now." Before Frankie could reply, a sound echoed through the basement. It wasn't through the phone. It was right outside the vault room, the shop. Distinct click of a carbon fiber cane tapping against the concrete floor. Tap, slide, tap. I dropped the satellite phone. I racked the pump of the Mossberg, chambering a heavy shell with a brutal mechanical clack. I stepped back, leveling the barrel at the open doorway of the vault. The tapping grew louder, echoing off the reinforced steel plates hidden behind the plaster. She walked into the harsh fluorescent light of the vault room. The black silk dress was immaculate. Her face was perfectly calm. She held the white cane in her right hand, sweeping it in small, precise arcs across the spotless concrete floor. Her emerald eyes stared directly at the gaping barrel of my shotgun. "You always seek the high ground, Vinny," she said softly, the smoky rasp of her voice vibrating against the steel walls. "But empires are not built on high ground. They are buried in the dirt, and this basement is nothing but dirt." I tightened my grip on the shotgun. The smell of her lavender soap wafted into the vault, cutting through the scent of old paper and cordite. "You killed my men," I growled. "They were weak," she replied, her gaze drifting casually over the stacks of currency on the shelves. "A family requires strength. You became complacent, Vincent, playing the noble protector to a broken bird. It made you soft. It made you predictable. Victor will kill you the moment he takes the port," I said, my finger tightening against the trigger guard. "You're a loose end." Eleanor stopped sweeping the cane. She planted the tip firmly on the concrete. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture so perfectly mimicking her blind persona that it sent a shiver down my spine. "Victor is an animal," she agreed. "A brute force instrument. He doesn't know about the offshore routing numbers. He doesn't know about the bearer bonds in this room. He thinks the prize is the real estate and the shipping lanes." She took a step closer. The shotgun barrel was now less than 3 feet from her chest. "You made a mistake, Vinny," she whispered, her eyes finally dropping from the gun to meet my gaze. "You assumed I spent 10 years in the dark, waiting to be saved. I spent 10 years in the dark, learning how to hunt in it. The lights in the vault room flickered violently, then snapped off completely. Absolute darkness slammed down like a physical weight. The absolute absence of light hit me with the physical force of a concrete wall. The heavy darkness did not just fill the room, it suffocated it, pressing against my eyeballs with a crushing barometric weight. The fading green afterimage of the fluorescent tubes burned into my retinas for a fraction of a second, a skeletal blueprint of the vault, before dissolving into a terrifying bottomless black. I did not blink. Blinking was a habit for the sighted, a reflex to clear debris from a functioning lens. In this pitch-black void, my open eyes were utterly useless. I became the blind man. The irony tasted like old pennies and battery acid on the back of my tongue. The heavy electrical hum of the lighting ballasts died away, leaving a silence so profound it made the blood roaring in my ears sound like a rushing river. The air in the vault instantly felt 10 degrees colder. The smell of the ambient ozone from the electrical surge mixed violently with the rich, oily scent of Hoppy's No. Cheen solvent emanating from the Mossberg in my hands. Beneath it all, threading through the cold air like a venomous snake, was the soft floral note of lavender. The scent was moving. I swept the barrel of the shotgun from left to right, tracking the invisible ghost. The heavy steel of the weapon was slick with the sudden cold sweat coating my palms. I did not pull the trigger. 8 rounds of Kung buckshot in a 12x12 steel box would turn the air into a meat grinder of ricocheting lead. Without a visual, firing was suicide. A soft whisper of fabric rubbing against fabric. Silk on silk. It came from the far left corner, near the top-tier shelves where the bearer bonds were stacked. You breathe entirely through your mouth when you panic, Vinny. Her voice did not come from the left. It echoed from the ceiling, bouncing off the brushed steel plates, creating an auditory hallucination that surrounded me. The smoky rasp was gone, replaced by a crystalline, hollow tone completely stripped of human empathy. "I am not panicking," I said. My voice sounded flat, deadened by the heavy acoustics of the room. I shifted my weight, sliding my right foot back half an inch to widen my base. The rubber sole of my dress shoe made a microscopic squeak against the polished concrete. "Your heart rate is hovering around 140 beats per minute," the voice drifted, this time seemingly from the floor to my right. "Your grip on the pump action is so tight, the tendons in your forearms are vibrating. You are projecting a heat signature that I can feel from across the room. 10 years. 3,650 days, navigating the dark." While I had been paying off politicians, running union rackets, and building a superficial fortress of cameras and armed guards, Eleanor had been mapping the microgeography of a lightless world. She knew how sound bent around the stacks of money. She knew the exact thermal gradients of the basement. I was a tourist in a nightmare she had engineered. I leveled the shotgun at the space precisely 2 feet above the last spot I heard her voice. I pulled the heavy trigger. The roar of the 12-gauge in the enclosed steel vault was apocalyptic. The concussion punched the air out of my lungs, a physical blow to the center of my chest. The muzzle flash erupted like a dying sun, a blinding cone of yellow and violent orange flame that illuminated the room for 1,000th of a second. In that frozen frame of light, I saw the stacks of $100 bills snowing down from the ceiling, shredded into green confetti by the spread of the buckshot. I saw the dented steel of the shelving unit. I did not see Eleanor. The darkness slammed back down, heavier and more disorienting than before. My ears shrieked with a high-pitched, agonizing whine that entirely wiped out my hearing. I was now blind and deaf. I racked the slide of the Mossberg. The physical vibration of the action cycling traveled up my arms, confirming the chambering of the next shell. An empty plastic hull hit the concrete somewhere to my left. I could not hear it land, but I felt the vibration through the soles of my shoes. I backed up slowly, keeping the shotgun raised, feeling for the heavy Mosler vault door with my shoulder. I needed the exit at my back. I needed a single point of entry to defend. My shoulder blades met the cold, solid steel of the door. I anchored myself. The ringing in my ears began to recede, leaving a low, steady thrum. You destroyed $250,000 in untraceable currency just to swat at a fly. Her voice cut through the fading ringing, smooth and undisturbed. She was closer now. The scent of lavender was overpowering the smell of burned cordite. Money is paper, I grunted, sweeping the barrel in a slow, tight arc. You don't care about the money. Victor doesn't care about the money. This is a hostile takeover. A low, vibrating hum began to emanate from the floorboards outside the vault. It was a mechanical grind, heavy and rhythmic. Victor cares about the port, Eleanor said. Her voice was directly in front of me now, perhaps 6 feet away. He cares about the logistics network. I care about the architecture of consequence. Consequence for what? I tightened my finger on the trigger. For believing that you could own a human life simply because you paid the hospital bills. Something small and metallic skipped across the concrete floor, stopping inches from my left foot. I did not look down. Looking down in the dark was a reflex of the weak. I kept the gun leveled straight ahead. The detonator, in Palermo, she whispered, the words drifting like cigarette smoke in the cold air. It was a dual-stage mercury switch, very sophisticated, very expensive. The kind of hardware the Corleone family used to import through the docks before you took them over. The temperature in the vault seemed to plummet another 20 degrees. My blood turned to slush. The air trapped in my throat refused to move. It wasn't the Lucchese family, I rasped, the syllables tearing at my vocal cords. They took credit for it. They took the money you offered them to take the credit, she corrected. The rustle of silk was gone. She was entirely motionless. You needed a war to consolidate power. You needed a tragedy to make the Commission sympathetic to your aggressive expansion. A car bomb. A dead rival. A beautiful, tragic wife permanently blinded by the collateral damage. It was the perfect narrative, Vincent. You wrote a masterpiece. The Mossberg felt as heavy as an anvil. The floor beneath my feet lost its solidity, turning into a shifting, treacherous surface. The grand lie I had built my entire empire upon the myth of the grieving, vengeance-driven husband was stripped bare in the blackness. You knew, I breathed. I smelled the mercury on your hands the morning we got into the Lancia, she replied. I felt the tension in your jaw when you insisted on driving instead of Carmine's father. But the blast radius was miscalculated. The glass took my sight, but only temporarily. The doctors in Switzerland, they were very well compensated to forge the permanent prognosis. The mechanical hum from outside the vault grew louder. A heavy hydraulic hiss followed. You lived in my house for 10 years, I said, the word slipping out as a jagged, mechanical sequence. You slept in my bed. You let me feed you. I studied you, she countered, the hostility finally bleeding through the pristine surface of her voice. I became the ultimate parasite. I mapped your ledgers, memorized your supply chains, identified every corrupt Port Authority official on your payroll. I needed to dismantle you not with a bullet, but by taking every single brick of your empire and handing it to the wolves. The heavy Mosler vault door against my back shuddered. The massive steel hinges groaned in the dark. The door was moving, slowly, inexorably. The 3-foot-thick slab of reinforced metal began to swing inward, pushing me away from the exit. She had triggered the emergency lockdown protocol from a remote switch. Once the door engaged the hydraulic rams, it would seal shut, driving the 4-inch titanium locking bolts deep into the frame. The vault was designed to withstand a seaborne charge. Once it closed, it would not open from the inside without the master code and a physical key. I had the key. I did not have the code. Frankie had the second half of the code. Frankie, who was currently bleeding out on Pier Bournemouth High. You're locking us both in, I shouted over the screeching metal. I am already gone, Vinny, the voice echoed. But it was distant now, bouncing off the far wall near the bearer bonds. A shadow moved in the absolute black, a disturbance in the air currents. She had projected her voice. She had never been standing directly in front of me. I lunged forward, abandoning the safety of the moving door. I swung the heavy stock of the Mossberg in a wide, horizontal arc, aiming for the space where the lavender scent was thickest. The wooden stock connected with something solid, a sharp exhalation of breath, the sickening crunch of cartilage. A blinding flare of white-hot pain erupted in my right bicep. The shotgun slipped from my grip, clattering uselessly to the concrete floor. She had bypassed the sweeping arc of the weapon, stepping inside my guard. I felt the heat of her body pressed against my side, the slick texture of the silk dress. She twisted her wrist. The stiletto blade buried in my muscle rotated 90 degrees, grating against the bone. A guttural roar ripped from my chest. I dropped my center of gravity, bringing my left elbow down in a brutal, plunging strike. It connected with her shoulder, a heavy, meaty impact that sent a shockwave up my own arm. She stumbled back, the stiletto tearing free from my flesh, taking a ribbon of muscle with it. Warm, thick blood instantly soaked the sleeve of my overcoat, pouring down my forearm and dripping rapidly onto the floor. The vault door was halfway closed. The hydraulic hiss was a deafening roar in the confined space. I drew the hunting knife from my ankle sheath with my left hand. The heavy, fixed blade felt crude compared to the surgical precision of her stiletto. I slashed blindly in the dark, carving figure eights in the empty air, trying to create a perimeter of razor-sharp steel. The blade caught empty air. The lavender scent dispersed, swirling wildly in the drafts created by the moving vault door. 10 years, Vinnie. Her voice drifted from the narrow gap remaining between the heavy steel door and the frame. She was already outside. Enjoy the money. I threw myself toward the gap. The hydraulic rams shrieked, protesting the resistance. The gap was less than 2 feet wide and closing rapidly. I hit the edge of the brushed steel frame with my right shoulder. The pain from the stab wound flared, a blinding supernova that forced black spots into my already lightless vision. I jammed my heavy leather shoe into the bottom track, trying to create friction. The door didn't even slow down. The gears ground relentlessly. I dropped to my knees, feeling blindly for the Mossberg. My slick, bloody fingers brushed the cold barrel. I grabbed the shotgun and jammed it vertically into the gap, wedging the steel receiver against the heavy strike plate of the doorframe. The Mosler door hit the shotgun. The heavy steel of the Mossberg groaned, a horrifying metallic scream of structural failure. The 12-gauge barrel began to bend, bowing inward under the astronomical pressure of the hydraulic rams. The gap narrowed to 14 inches, 12 inches, 10. I turned completely sideways, expelling every cubic inch of air from my lungs. I forced my head and left shoulder through the gap. The jagged, crushing edge of the steel door pinned my chest. The pressure was unimaginable. My ribs flexed, crying out under the weight of a dozen tons of moving metal. The receiver of the shotgun cracked. A sharp, explosive snap. The door surged forward another 2 inches. My vision swam. The metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth. I dug the fingers of my left hand into the rough concrete of the hallway floor outside the vault, dragging my body forward like a crushed insect. The Mossberg shattered entirely, the high-carbon steel exploding into shrapnel. The Mosler door slammed shut with a concussive boom that shook the foundation of the estate. The 4-inch titanium locking bolts engaged, automatically, a sequence of heavy, final thuds that sealed the tomb forever. I collapsed onto the floor of the hallway, gasping violently. The air outside the vault tasted like dust and copper. My right arm was completely numb, a dead appendage hanging from a torn shoulder. The right side of my ribcage felt like a bag of broken glass. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the wire mesh bulbs on the ceiling. The basement lights had flickered back on, casting a dim, sickly yellow glow over the corridor. I was alive. I was outside the vault. But the house above me was a war zone. The distant, muffled staccato of automatic gunfire echoed down the steep stone stairs. Victor's men were systematically clearing the estate. I forced myself up onto my left knee. The world tilted violently. Blood pattered a steady, sickening rhythm on the concrete. I leaned heavily against the cold plaster wall. The false trail, the locked padlock, the scratch, the ash, the Palermo bombing. The pieces of the puzzle were completely assembled, forming a picture of absolute, unmitigated ruin. She had orchestrated the destruction of the Maranzano family with the patience of a glacier. She had let me build the empire specifically so she could hand the keys to a rival who would tear it down, leaving me to rot in the basement. I stumbled forward, dragging my right leg. The heavy hunting knife was still clutched in my left hand, a pathetic, primitive tool against the military hardware waiting upstairs. I reached the bottom of the stone stairs. The heavy iron door at the top, the one I had shot open, hung crookedly on its hinges. Above it, the hallway was thick with the grey smoke of detonated stun grenades. The Chin Fan Trum was clear. She hated me. She survived the blast. She learned my business. She sold me to Victor. But as I began the agonizing climb up the stone steps, a single, solitary thought pierced the heavy fog of pain and adrenaline, a microscopic inconsistency that defied the flawless logic of her revenge. If she knew about the mercury switch in Palermo on the day of the bombing, if she smelled it on my hands before we even got into the car. Why did she get in the car? The first step was a negotiation with gravity. My right leg dragged across the stone, the heavy leather sole catching on the rough edge of the riser. The pain radiating from my severed bicep was no longer a sharp, localized fire. It had transformed into a deep, vibrating hum that echoed through my entire skeletal structure. I pressed my left shoulder against the cold, damp plaster of the stairwell wall, leaving a thick, smeared trail of arterial blood in my wake. The heavy hunting knife in my left hand felt like an anchor, but I clamped my fingers around the leather grip until my knuckles turned white. Above me, the staccato rhythm of the automatic weapons had ceased. The silence that replaced it was heavier than the darkness of the vault. It was the absolute final silence of a graveyard. I took the second step, the third. The metallic scent of copper pooling in my own mouth, mixed with the bitter, acidic smell of the stun grenades drifting down from the foyer. I breathed entirely through my nose, forcing the oxygen into my lungs in shallow, controlled bursts to prevent my shattered ribs from puncturing a lung. If she smelled the mercury on my hands, why did she get in the car? The question pulsed behind my eyes, a synchronized rhythm with my failing heartbeat. It defied the survival instincts of an apex predator. You do not willingly walk into a blast radius unless the blast is the camouflage for something much worse. I reached the top of the stairs. The black iron door hung at a grotesque angle, the hinges warped by the suppressing fire of the Spetsnaz operative. I stepped over his body. His blood had already begun to coagulate on the stone floor, a dark, sticky pool reflecting the sickly yellow light of the corridor. I pushed through the doorway and entered the east wing of the estate. The carnage was absolute. The walls, lined with imported silk wallpaper, were shredded. The mahogany side tables were splintered into kindling. The air was a thick, suffocating fog of drywall dust, cordite, and the distinct, coppery stench of massive trauma. I moved down the hallway, keeping my profile low, sliding my feet across the debris-strewn Carrara marble. 3 more bodies lay in the corridor leading to the main living area. 2 of them were Russian hitters, massive men clad in black tactical gear, their chest plates shattered by heavy rifle fire. The third was Carmine, my driver. He lay on his back, his eyes fixed on the vaulted ceiling, a single, clean bullet hole exactly between his eyes. The entry wound was small, precise, not the chaotic spray of a submachine gun, an executioner's mark. I stepped into the grand living room. The floor lamp I had used to spot Elena was shattered, casting the room into deep, jagged shadows illuminated only by the ambient glow of the security floodlights, piercing the rain-slicked windows outside. The heavy oak furniture was overturned. The Persian rugs were saturated with dark stains. But it wasn't the destruction that halted my breath. It was the geography of the dead. 5 more Spetsnaz operatives were scattered across the room. They had not died in a firefight. They had not been gunned down by my loyalists. I looked at the body nearest the grand piano. His throat was completely crushed, a deep, purple indentation perfectly matching the diameter of a carbon fiber cane. The man near the fireplace had a slender, silver letter opener buried to the hilt in his medulla oblongata. They had breached the house expecting to execute a blind woman and an unarmed boss. They had walked into a slaughterhouse run by a phantom. A shadow shifted in the far corner of the room, near the archway leading to the private study. I raised the hunting knife, my left arm shaking violently from the blood loss. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the cold, crushing reality of hypovolemic shock. My vision narrowed, a dark tunnel closing in on the periphery of my sight. "Put the knife down, Vinny. You're bleeding on the Harry's rug. It's an antique." The voice was pristine, unhurried. It drifted from the heavy leather armchair sitting behind my mahogany desk in the study. I dragged my feet across the marble, crossing the threshold into the study. The room smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and the heavy, sweet scent of a freshly lit Parliament cigarette. Elena was sitting behind my desk, the absolute center of my empire. She had a heavy crystal tumbler of Macallan in her left hand. The black silk dress was immaculate, save for a single, dark smear of blood near the hem. Her emerald eyes tracked my movement with the cold, detached interest of a scientist observing a dying insect. Lying face down on the floor, perfectly still, was Viktor Rostova. The massive Russian boss looked deflated, a mountain of muscle reduced to dead weight. A thin line of blood trickled from his left ear, pooling on the floorboards. "Victor was sloppy," Elena murmured, taking a slow sip of the scotch. The ice clinked gently against the crystal. He sent his men in first to do the heavy lifting, then walked in expecting to claim the throne. He didn't check his corners. I leaned against the doorframe of the study. My legs were giving out. The heavy hunting knife slipped from my slick fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. I didn't try to pick it up. "You killed them all," I rasped, my voice sounding like dry leaves crushed under a boot. "They were a blunt instrument," she replied, resting the tumbler on the leather blotter of the desk. "I needed them to clear out your security. I needed them to secure the perimeter so no local law enforcement would interrupt. They served their purpose. And Frankie?" Eleanor leaned back in the chair, picking up the Parliament resting in the crystal ashtray. She inhaled deeply, the tip glowing a harsh cherry red in the dim room. She exhaled a long, thin stream of blue smoke. "Frankie is dead, Vinny." The moment Victor's trucks rolled onto Pier Bournemouth High, his men opened fire. No negotiations. No demands. "Frankie died thinking he was protecting your cargo. He died exactly as you designed him to, a loyal dog defending an empty yard." The temperature in my veins dropped to absolute zero. The architecture of her revenge was flawless. She had weaponized every single piece on the board. She used Frankie's loyalty to separate him from me. She used my paranoia to lock me in a vault. She used Victor's greed to eliminate my private army, and then she eliminated Victor. She was the only one left. I slid down the doorframe, my legs finally refusing to hold my weight. I hit the hardwood floor hard, my shattered ribs grinding together. The pain was distant now, a localized static fading into a general numbness. The cold was creeping up my extremities. I looked up at her, the woman I had spent 10 years treating as fragile glass. The emerald eyes stared back, completely devoid of pity, remorse, or triumph. It was just business. "Palermo," I whispered. The word took almost all the air left in my lungs. "The car. If you knew, why did you get in?" Eleanor paused. She tapped the ash of the cigarette into the crystal tray. The sound was incredibly loud in the silent house. She stood up, walking slowly around the massive mahogany desk. She moved with absolute, predatory grace. No hesitation, no reliance on sound. She walked over to where I lay bleeding out against the doorframe. She crouched down. The scent of lavender overpowered the smell of the blood soaking my coat. She reached out, her cool, delicate fingers tracing the line of my jaw. "Because you were never going to pull the trigger, Vincent," she said softly, her voice barely a breath against the ambient silence. I stared at her, the confusion slowing my dying neurons. "You bought the Mercury switch," she continued, her green eyes locked onto mine. "You hired the mechanic in Sicily. You wanted a war with my father's family. You wanted to be the undisputed king. But you were weak. You hesitated. You kept the detonator in your coat pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment that didn't exist." She leaned closer. Her breath smelled of peat smoke and expensive tobacco. My father was going to kill you the next morning, Vinny. He knew about the offshore accounts. He knew you were moving on the ports. I saw the orders on his desk. If you didn't strike, you were going to be found in the trunk of a Fiat with your throat cut, and I would have been married off to one of his brutal capos to solidify a new alliance. The edges of my vision turned black. Only her face remained in the center of the narrowing tunnel. I didn't smell the mercury on your hands, she whispered, her lips almost brushing my ear. I stole the switch from your coat. I wired it to the ignition of the Lancia myself. I altered the blast radius. I calculated the exact trajectory of the windshield glass. It was a mathematical risk, but it was the only way. The breath rattled in my throat. The ultimate truth was a poison far more lethal than the blood loss. I got in the car, she said, her voice turning to pure ice. Because I had to turn the key. I had to force you to become the monster you only pretended to be. I needed you to feel so much guilt for destroying my life that you would build an empire just to lay it at my feet. I didn't survive your ambition, Vincent. You survived mine. She stood up. The warmth of her proximity vanished, leaving only the freezing air of the destroyed estate. She looked down at me, her expression entirely unreadable. You built a good house, Vinny, but you were always just the contractor. I am the architect. She turned away, walking back toward the mahogany desk. She picked up the crystal tumbler and the heavy leather ledger holding the offshore routing numbers. She didn't look back. My head lolled to the side. My cheek rested against the cold hardwood floor. The pool of my own blood was spreading outward, reaching the edge of the antique rug. The pain was gone entirely now. The sounds of the house, the rain against the glass, the distant hum of the security gate faded into a flat, continuous tone. The underworld was a machine. It did not run on loyalty or honor or the bonds of blood. It ran on leverage. It ran on the ruthless, mathematical calculation of who was willing to sacrifice the most flesh to turn the gears. I thought I was the operator of the machine, but from the moment the glass shattered in Palermo, I was nothing but the fuel. The darkness finally swept in, heavy and absolute, but this time there was no phantom waiting in the shadows. There was only the cold, unyielding concrete of a world built on lies, and the slow, inevitable fade to black.